Imagine the world watching a mighty military power, confident and arrogant, mocking the unprepared Americans. They laughed at their perceived weaknesses, dismissed their strategy, and counted them out before the battle even began. But what they didn't know was that beneath that calm exterior lay innovation, resilience, and determination that would shock the world. Today, I'll take you on a journey where the Americans turned ridicule into triumph, where strategy, courage, and relentless spirit flipped expectations, and where history remembers the moment the mockers themselves were left stunned. If you think you know this story, think again. The real lessons lie in the details, and what happened next will leave you questioning everything you thought about underdogs and power. The story begins with a scene that could have been plucked straight from the pages of history books, where confidence turned into arrogance and ridicule became a weapon. The Americans, seen by their opponents as inexperienced, untested, and ill-prepared, were the subject of sneers and mockery long before the first sign of action. Across military headquarters, strategy rooms, and social circles, experts and onlookers alike laughed at the thought that these green recruits could pose any real challenge. Their technology, while steadily improving, was dismissed as inferior. Their training, though rigorous, was mocked as amateurish. Opponents studied them casually, underestimating their resolve and commitment, assuming victory would be effortless. The mockery was relentless, echoing in public discourse and private conversations alike, creating an environment where contempt for the Americans was universal. Yet, beneath that laughter, a quiet determination began to take shape. The Americans, fully aware of the underestimation, did not respond with brash words or hasty displays of power. Instead, they allowed their opponents to underestimate them, letting complacency and overconfidence creep into the minds of those who mocked. While the world scoffed, the Americans were observing, learning, and refining. Every dismissal, every taunt became a silent motivator. Where others saw ridicule, they saw opportunity, the perfect conditions for a strategic advantage. This was not merely a story of arrogance meeting resilience. It was a tale of perception versus reality. The mockers assumed that courage could only be measured in experience and resources, failing to recognize that determination and ingenuity often outweigh raw power. The Americans, though younger, fewer in number, or lacking the historical prestige of their adversaries, harnessed the power of preparation, adaptability, and creative problem-solving. They trained under conditions designed to test not just skill but endurance, pushing themselves beyond conventional limits. Every exercise, every drill, and every tactical simulation was a calculated step toward proving the world wrong. Even in social and political circles, this mockery was palpable. International observers predicted swift defeats. Newspapers wrote dismissive editorials, and rival commanders treated encounters with disdain, confident that the Americans could not rise to the challenge. What they failed to realize was that such mockery had a hidden consequence. It fueled an unspoken resolve. Each insult became a challenge, every sneer a silent battle cry, and slowly, the Americans transformed the perception of weakness into a source of strength. The laughter that surrounded them, intended to intimidate or belittle, instead became a catalyst for growth, teaching them patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of never revealing the full extent of their capabilities until the moment was right. It was in this environment of ridicule that the Americans learned one of history's most important lessons. Underestimation is a weapon in the hands of those who refuse to be dismissed. By being laughed at, they gained the advantage of invisibility, the chance to grow stronger while their enemies' arrogance blinded them to the real threat. And as the first signs of action approached, the Americans were ready, not just with firepower or tactics, but with the unshakable confidence born from being underestimated and refusing to succumb to it. While the world laughed and dismissed them, the Americans quietly began to prepare in ways their adversaries could never have imagined. Preparation, they knew, was not just about learning tactics or drilling endlessly. It was about building resilience, sharpening instincts, and anticipating every possible scenario that could arise. Where their opponents relied on arrogance and past successes, the Americans relied on discipline, adaptability, and a mindset that refused to accept defeat before the battle even began. Every day, in training grounds hidden from prying eyes, soldiers pushed themselves beyond perceived limits. Long hours of physical exertion, mental challenges, and simulated combat conditions forged not just skill, but unshakable confidence. They learned to think quickly under pressure, to adapt to unexpected circumstances, and to trust each other implicitly in the heat of the moment. This preparation went beyond the obvious military drills. Leaders studied maps, historical battles, and intelligence reports meticulously. They sought to understand not just their own weaknesses, but the psychology of those who mocked them. Every misstep, every assumption made by their opponents became a lesson. Where the world saw inexperience, the Americans saw opportunity. They realized that patience was their secret weapon, that allowing others to underestimate them gave them the strategic advantage of surprise. Quietly, relentlessly, they refined strategies that were flexible, unconventional, and precise, capable of turning even the most challenging situations into opportunities for victory. Discipline became the cornerstone of their strength. Every soldier, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned officer, understood that victory would not come from bravado or luck, but from preparation executed flawlessly under pressure. They trained in diverse environments, harsh terrain, simulated urban warfare, extreme weather conditions, not because it was required, but because they knew the element of unpredictability could strike at any moment. Mental toughness was nurtured as carefully as physical strength, instilling the belief that challenges, no matter how insurmountable they seemed, could be overcome with clarity, focus, and perseverance. Innovation and strategy were equally important. The Americans were not content to follow conventional methods. They experimented with tactics, logistics, and coordination to maximize their efficiency and effectiveness. Each exercise, each simulated battle, was an opportunity to test new ideas and learn from failures in controlled conditions. By the time the actual confrontation arrived, what had seemed like inexperience to the outside world was, in fact, a carefully honed force, prepared to respond to any situation with intelligence and precision. What set them apart was not just their preparation, but the mindset they cultivated while doing it. Where their adversaries were arrogant, confident in the power of tradition and past victories, the Americans cultivated humility and awareness. They trained not for show, not for applause, but for results. Every sneer, every mocking statement from the outside world fueled their determination, but it never distracted them from their objective. And when the moment came to act, all of this preparation, rigorous training, strategic planning, mental toughness, and adaptability would converge, creating an unstoppable force that would shock those who had once laughed. The turning point arrived quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, like the calm before a storm that no one saw coming. The Americans, long underestimated and mocked, moved with precision and purpose, striking in ways that their opponents could neither predict nor comprehend. It was not a moment born of luck or chance. It was the culmination of months, even years, of preparation, training, and careful observation. The battlefield, once imagined as a place where they would falter, became the stage where their strategy, ingenuity, and resilience would be revealed in full force. As the confrontation began, the mockers were confident. They had counted on arrogance and complacency to carry them through, believing the Americans would crumble under pressure or make predictable mistakes. Yet from the very first moves, it became clear that something was different. Coordination was flawless. Units operated seamlessly, anticipating one another's actions and responding with a precision that caught the opposition off guard. The Americans had studied every possible scenario and now executed their plan with a calm and deadly efficiency. Every maneuver, every calculated decision was designed to exploit weaknesses the opponents didn't even realize they had. The effect was immediate. Surprise struck like lightning. Opposing forces, expecting an easy triumph, found themselves reacting to strategies they hadn't even considered. Positions thought secure were suddenly vulnerable. Attacks planned with arrogance and certainty were countered with ingenuity and speed. Confusion spread among the mockers, whose confidence had blinded them to the Americans' capability. As each unexpected move unfolded, disbelief replaced laughter, and panic began to seep into the ranks of those who had once scoffed at the underdogs. What made this turning point even more powerful was the psychological dimension. The Americans had not only mastered tactics, they had mastered timing and deception. They struck when their adversaries were least prepared, leveraging the element of surprise to amplify every advantage. It was not brute force alone that caused the tide to turn. It was intelligence, foresight, and patience. Every calculated risk paid off, and with every success, their opponent's sense of control and superiority eroded further. Confidence turned to doubt, arrogance gave way to fear, and the very laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by tension and disbelief. By the time the dust settled on the initial engagements, it was undeniable. The mockers had misjudged the Americans completely. What had seemed like inexperience and weakness was, in reality, strength meticulously disguised. The turning point was not a single event, but a series of moments where preparation met opportunity, where patience met precision, and where skill met determination. It was the moment when expectations shattered, when ridicule was transformed into astonishment, and when the underestimated force proved that true power is not always obvious at first glance. History would remember this moment not for the laughter that preceded it, but for the shock that followed. The Americans had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that underestimation is a dangerous mistake, and that true strength often lies where others least expect it. In that turning point, the story shifted forever, and the world watched in awe as the underdogs revealed themselves as masters of strategy and resilience, leaving their mockers questioning everything they thought they knew. While the world watched, expecting the Americans to stumble under pressure, they quietly leveraged a factor no one anticipated: innovation. It was not merely the number of soldiers or the strength of weaponry that would decide the outcome, but the ingenuity with which every tool, tactic, and technique was employed. The Americans understood that conventional thinking could only take them so far. To truly overcome the mockery and disbelief of their adversaries, they had to think differently, act unpredictably, and exploit every advantage that others overlooked. Their technology, previously dismissed, became a force multiplier, transforming ordinary equipment into instruments of extraordinary effectiveness. The cleverness began with strategy. American commanders recognized that battles are often won not by brute force, but by anticipating the moves of those who assume they are superior. They devised operations that relied on speed, precision, and the element of surprise. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft were not just tools of destruction. They were instruments of coordination, synchronized to achieve maximum impact. Innovations in communication allowed units to coordinate with unprecedented accuracy, reacting to changing conditions faster than anyone could predict. This adaptability turned every skirmish into a lesson in unpredictability for the mockers, who had counted on routine and predictability to maintain their advantage. But innovation was not limited to hardware or technology. The Americans employed unconventional tactics that defied traditional military doctrine. They used deception to mislead their opponents, creating false fronts, feints, and distractions that drew enemy attention away from critical objectives. Ambushes were carefully planned not as desperate maneuvers, but as calculated strikes designed to exploit overconfidence. Their opponents, who had assumed familiarity with standard battlefield approaches, were repeatedly caught off guard. What seemed like improvisation to outsiders was, in fact, the product of meticulous planning and relentless creativity. Even on the ground, small details mattered. Soldiers were trained to think independently, make rapid decisions, and leverage their environment to their advantage. Equipment was modified to suit specific missions, and new technologies were integrated seamlessly into existing systems. Every adaptation increased efficiency and effectiveness, and by the time the first clash occurred, the Americans had created a level of preparedness that their adversaries had not even imagined possible. This combination of technology, innovation, and unconventional thinking had a profound psychological effect. The mockers, confident in their superiority, were bewildered by strategies they could neither predict nor counter. Every clever maneuver, every unexpected use of technology left them questioning their assumptions and scrambling to respond. The very factor that had caused them to dismiss the Americans, perceived inexperience and technological inferiority, was now their undoing. What had been underestimated became overwhelming, and the laughter of the past turned into astonishment and fear. Through innovation and ingenuity, the Americans demonstrated that power is not always measured by size, resources, or reputation. True strength lies in the ability to adapt, to think creatively under pressure, and to turn what others see as limitations into advantages. The mockers had laughed, confident that victory would be easy, but in the end they were blindsided by a force they could neither predict nor comprehend, proving that brilliance and innovation often triumph over arrogance and complacency. As the Americans executed their strategies with precision and innovation, the psychological impact on their opponents became increasingly evident. The same forces that had once laughed and mocked now found themselves disoriented, frustrated, and utterly unprepared for what they faced. Confidence, which had once been so unshakable, began to crumble as the mockers realized that their assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Every move the Americans made seemed to defy expectation. Every maneuver designed not only to gain an advantage, but to instill doubt, confusion, and fear in the minds of those who had underestimated them. The mockers had relied on arrogance, believing that past victories and superior resources guaranteed success. They assumed the Americans would falter under pressure, make predictable mistakes, and reveal their weaknesses at the critical moment. Yet none of this happened. Instead, the Americans displayed calm, discipline, and tactical brilliance that left their adversaries scrambling to adapt. Orders were issued hastily, strategies were abandoned mid-course, and hesitation replaced decisiveness. For the first time, the mockers experienced what it felt like to face an enemy who was not only competent, but one step ahead at every turn. This psychological blow was compounded by the realization that underestimation had been a critical error. The mockers had failed to account for resilience, ingenuity, and the determination that comes from being dismissed. Each unexpected tactic, each clever maneuver, was a reminder that their assumptions were dangerously flawed. Panic began to creep into their ranks, and the unified sense of superiority fractured as doubt spread from the highest commanders down to the soldiers on the ground. Communication broke down, decisions became erratic, and morale plummeted, further amplifying the Americans' advantage. What made this moment particularly devastating was the cumulative effect of the Americans' preparation and execution. The adversaries had been caught not by a single brilliant tactic, but by a combination of precision, innovation, and relentless adaptability. Every successful strike, every clever use of technology, and every flawlessly executed maneuver served as a psychological dagger, eroding confidence and making even basic actions seem daunting. The mockers realized too late that their laughter and arrogance had blinded them to the true strength of the Americans. Even those who had expected to manage the chaos were forced to acknowledge that the situation was no longer controllable. Their strategies were failing, Their assumptions shattered, and the Americans, once underestimated, were now dictating the flow of battle. The humiliation was complete. They had mocked a force they assumed weak, and now they faced the bitter reality of being outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. In this moment, it became clear that the greatest victory was not measured solely in territory or casualties, but in the psychological dominance achieved over those who had once derided them. The Americans had turned ridicule into their greatest weapon, using it to fuel preparation, strategy, and innovation. The mockers were left to grapple with disbelief and humiliation, a reminder that arrogance and underestimation can be as fatal as any weapon on the battlefield. Aftermath of the confrontation left a mark far beyond the battlefield, reverberating through history and shaping perceptions for generations. What had begun as mockery and derision transformed into admiration, respect, and a profound understanding of what true strength entails. The Americans, underestimated and dismissed, had proven that preparation, innovation, and resilience could overcome even the harshest ridicule. Their victory was not just tactical, it was symbolic, a reminder that the assumptions of the arrogant are fragile, and the underestimated often hold the power to surprise the world. The legacy of this moment extended into every corner where decisions are made and perceptions are formed. Leaders, both military and civilian, began to recognize that dismissing an opponent based on appearances or reputation can be a grave mistake. It was a lesson that went beyond weaponry and numbers, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, adaptability, and psychological insight. The Americans' ability to leverage mockery, turning it into motivation and strategic advantage, became a case study in the power of mindset and preparation. Those who once sneered had been forced to confront a new reality. The most formidable adversaries are often those underestimated the most. Generations that followed learned from this example, not only in military strategy, but in broader life lessons. The story demonstrated that resilience is built not in the absence of challenge, but through overcoming it, and that innovation often thrives under pressure. The Americans' response to derision showcased how adversity can sharpen focus, fuel determination, and ignite creativity. Leaders and strategists studied these principles, understanding that success often depends on the ability to transform weaknesses perceived by others into strengths that can decisively change outcomes. This legacy also changed the way the Americans themselves were perceived internationally. Once considered inexperienced and unworthy of serious consideration, they became a force whose capabilities demanded respect. The world learned that appearances and assumptions could be deceiving, and that courage, ingenuity, and preparation could overturn even the most confident adversaries. Mockery, once their burden, became the foundation of a reputation built on triumph against expectation. The lesson was clear. Underestimating others can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment, shaping perceptions, morale, and history itself. Moreover, the Americans' triumph highlighted the intangible qualities that define greatness: patience, strategic thinking, mental toughness, and the willingness to adapt. It reminded future generations that success is rarely about instant recognition, but about consistent effort, discipline, and the quiet cultivation of advantage while others remain distracted or dismissive. The mockers' failure underscored the dangers of arrogance, while the Americans' victory illustrated the power of preparation, innovation, and belief in one's own potential. In the end, this story became more than a battle. It became a lesson for humanity. The mockery faded, but the impact endured. The Americans had turned ridicule into strength, disbelief into admiration, and doubt into inspiration. They showed that true power is not always visible at first glance, and that those who prepare quietly, think strategically, and act decisively often leave the world astonished. Their legacy continues to teach that underestimation is a perilous mistake, and that triumph often belongs to those who refuse to be defined by the expectations of others. In the end, they didn't just beat the odds, They rewrote the expectations of the world. What was once mockery became admiration, ridicule became respect, and doubt turned into awe. The lesson is clear: never underestimate those who prepare quietly, think strategically, and fight with unwavering resolve. So, next time someone laughs at your ambition, remember this story, because history proves that sometimes the quietest forces create the loudest impact.